لا ينقصه. شيخ نور الدين عطر
This meeting is being recorded.
طبعا في ابن كثير لا ينقصه دي put ضماده. فلا ينقص من الحديث إلا ما لا تعلق له بما يبقيه منه بحيث لا تختلف الدلالة ولا يختل البيان حتى يكون المذكور والمحذوف بمنزلة خبرين أو يدل ما ذكره على ما حذفه بخلاف الجاهل فإنه قد ينقص ما لا تعلق كترك الاستثناء. So until here, the objective of Ibn Hajar rahmallah was to discuss Musahaf and Muharraf, which we discussed in the last lesson. But now, in passing, Ibn Hajar rahmallah discusses something else, and that is the issue of summarizing a narration. So in the previous paragraph, he explained that it is only permissible for a scholar to drop off any words of a narration, or even to use a synonym or a similar word in the narration. The previous paragraph was, وَلَا يَجُوزُ تَعَمُّدُ تَغْيِيرِ سُورَةِ الْمَتْنِ مُطْلَقًا. In all circumstances, it's not permissible. And he said ta'ammud. So it's not permissible to deliberately alter the form of the text. وَلَا إِبْدَالُ اللَّفْظِ الْمُرَادِفِ بِاللَّفْظِ الْمُرَادِفِ لَهُ. Or to use one word, a similar word for the word which is mentioned in the hadith. And he mentions إلا لعالم بمدلولات الألفاظ وما يحيل المعاني على الصحيح في المسألتين. So he says that this here is only for permissible for that person who is a scholar and well aware of the indication of the words according to the correct view in both of the two mas'alas. So يقصر الحافظ رحمه الله أنه لا يجوز تغيير متن الحديث بنقص من ألفاظه وجمله وهو ما يعرف باختصار الحديث والاقتصار على بعض دون بعض ولا تعمد إبدال ألفاظ أو بعضها بالمرادف وهو ما يعرف بالرواية بالمعنى. So he indicated the two masail. The first is اختصار الحديث and the second is رواية بالمعنى. He first mentions the ruling of اختصار الحديث, which is summarizing the narration, and thereafter is going to mention the ruling on رواية بالمعنى, quoting the entire text in one's own words. So it is important to note that both these chapters, اختصار الحديث and رواية بالمعنى, they are both mentioned just in passing, and neither of them form part of the discussion on ta'an al-rawi. So you remember that we are still discussing ta'an al-rawi, and we're on the 7th type. So I hope you are able to make a mental map of this entire book, that how Ibn Hajar rahmallah started the kitab, and then how what he went on to discussing, then how he came onto ta'an al-rawi and all the different types of ta'an al-rawi and what falls under all of it. So these two chapters, which is discussing here, اختصار الحديث, and the next chapter of رواية بالمعنى, they are not related to the broader discussion of ta'an al-rawi, and likewise they do not fall under the 7th category which we were discussing. So they are not necessarily linked to mukhalafa. So that means that this here is a digression from what we are discussing until now. Now, whether you want to criticize the author for the tartib or not, this is something which is subjective. Because one could argue that since it does have similarity with Musahaf and Muharraf, so it's like a sub-chapter, and others could view it that since it has no link to the main discussion or to the discussion which we are discussing here, therefore it would have been better for Ibn Hajar rahmallah not to mention this here. So you know why we always highlight the tartib and the order and the sequence, isn't it? Is because Ibn Hajar rahmallah, he criticized the scholars before him about tartib. So therefore we constantly need to scrutinize his own tartib and see whether he presented his in the best of orders. So coming to this discussion, the ideal is that a narrator should always narrate the hadith in full. But you will find that there are many different times and different circumstances which could arise, and it becomes difficult for a person to narrate the entire narration in a full. Like for example, at times a narration is extremely lengthy, and the scholar, he just needs to mention the gist to get his point across. So Ibn Hajar rahmallah discusses now the ruling of condensing and summarizing a narration, but he just mentioned his preferred view. So Ibn Hajar Rahmallah is of the view that it is only permissible for a scholar and a knowledgeable person to summarize and to abridge a narration. So if a person is not a scholar, he doesn't know the lugha even well, then it will not be permissible for him to condense a narration. And the reason which he gives is that a scholar and an expert, he will be well aware of the intent, the connotations, the objective of the narration. So when mentioning it in short and when condensing it, he will be sure to still convey the implication of that narration. So Ibn Hajar Rahmallah says that أما اختصار الحديث فالأكثرون على جوازه. The vast majority are of the view that it is permissible. However, there is an integral condition بشرط أن يكون الذي يختصره عالما. The one who is summarizing it, he needs to be a scholar. He needs to know all about the connotations, etc. of the words. لأن العالم لا ينقص من الحديث إلا ما لا تعلق له بما يبقيه منه. Because an alim, he will know which words to mention and how to convey the exact same meaning in shorter words. So this here is, like we're saying, the one view which Ibn Hajar Rahmallah mentioned, but there are other views as well. Mullah al-Qari Rahmallah explains that اختلف العلماء في جواز الاقتصار على بعض الحديث وحذف بعضه على أقوال. There are various different views. أحدها, the first is المنع مطلقا, that it's not permissible at all. You have to narrate a hadith exactly as it was transmitted. You cannot summarize it, you cannot mention it in short. بناء على معنى الرواية بالمعنى لما فيه من التصرف في الجملة. Because you cannot play around with the matan in any way. So Allama al-Qani Rahmallah mentions the reason. He says لأن رواية الحديث ناقصا تقطعه وتغيره من وجهه. That you cannot alter the text in any way, and therefore it will not even be permissible to summarize the narration. You have to mention the exact words which have been conveyed to you. To mention the names of few random scholars who did not regard it as permissible, you have Allama Khalil ibn Ahmad Rahmallah. He was of this view. So he made istidlal from the narration. You know, when Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam made dua for a person who memorizes the ahadith, then Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, نَضَّرَ اللَّهُ امْرَأً سَمِعَ مَقَالَتِي فَوَعَّاهَا فَأَدَّاهَا كَمَا سَمِعَهَا. So كَمَا سَمِعَهَا, yet he transmits it, he conveys it in the exact same way that he heard it. So Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam is not allowing that a person can summarize it or just give the meaning. He didn't say that he conveys the meaning of it. Rather he said فَأَدَّاهَا كَمَا سَمِعَهَا. So hence Khalil ibn Ahmad, he said لا يحل اختصار الحديث لأن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال رحم الله. So obviously all different words it comes. رحم الله, نذر الله. But نذر الله is, if you want to see the testament of it, you can look at the face of a muhaddith and you will see the nur which is gushing from his face. نذر الله امرأ سمع مقالتي فأداها كما سمعها. And then the scholars who held this view, they also looked at the reality. So for example, Yahya ibn Adam, he said, Ibn Abi Khaythama, he mentions this here in his tarikh, that Yahya ibn Adam, he said, ما رأيت أحدا يختصر الحديث إلا وهو يخطئ إلا ابن عيينة. That the reality is that those who are trying to summarize a narration and trying to condense it, they are making mistakes. إلا ابن عيينة, except Ibn Uyayna rahimahullah. He doesn't make mistakes, but the vast majority of others, they are all making mistakes. Likewise, Abbas ibn Muhammad al-Dawri, he said that Su'ila Abu Asim al-Nabil, that the scholar Abu Asim al-Nabil, he was asked that, is it makruh, is it detested to summarize a narration? So he responded and said, Na'am. And why? لأنهم يخطئون المعنى. So you can see that they are looking at the reality. So when establishing the principle, mentioning the ruling, they looked at what's happening. that people are making mistakes. And because that is the reality, people are making mistakes, therefore we should close this door and we should not allow it. So these scholars regarded it as impermissible to summarize a narration. Thereafter, the second view which Mullah al-Qari rahmallah mentions, وَثَانِيهَا الْجَوَازُ مُطْلَقًا. There are those who regarded it as permissible in all circumstances. So they are looking at the fact that from the beginning, the narrator already had to tick so many boxes and he had to fulfill so many conditions before we could even look at his narration, leave alone accept his narration. The person had to be adil, had to be upright, likewise he had to have a good memory. Also that narration itself cannot be shadh, it cannot contradict others, it cannot have any hidden defects. So since those conditions are already there, they all already will exterminate the possibility of the narrator making such a huge blunder, that it will actually alter the meaning of the whole narration. If you want to, you can phrase it in a different way, like how it comes in Ikhtisar Ulum al-Ḥadīth. Allama ibn Kathir rahmallah, he mentions from Ibn al-Hajib rahmallah, that حذف بعض الخبر جائز عند الأكثر. It's like how Ibn Hajar, you can see Ibn Hajar rahmallah said, فَالْأَكْثَرُونَ عَلَى جَوَازٍ. So the broad ruling is that it's permissible, and thereafter you create the restriction. So Ibn Hajar is creating the restriction that the person has to be knowledgeable. But here Ibn Hajib is not putting that condition. He's rather just going directly to what will alter the meaning. إِلَّا فِي الْغَايَةِ وَالْإِسْتِثْنَاءِ. So you can see it mentioning it in that way. Generally it is permissible, but it has a few exclusions. Ibn Hajar is mentioning a much broader exclusion, and here they are confining the exclusion. So the general ruling is that it is permissible. And the proponents of this view, they also have one of the earlier scholars to back up their view. Mujahid rahmallah, he used to say that أَنْقِسْ مِنَ الْحَدِيثِ مَا شِئْتِ, that you can subtract from a narration what you want, وَلَا تَزِدْ فِيهِ, but never ever increase on the narration. Don't add extra things. So delete what you want from the narration, but don't add additional points in the narration. That's the second view which you have with regards to this mas'ala. And then the third view which you have, Mullah al-Qari rahmallah said, وَثَانِيهَا أَنَّهُ إِن لَمْ يَكُنْ رَوَاهُ هُوَ أَوْ غَيْرُهُ عَلَى التَّمَامِ مَرَّةً أُخْرَى لَمْ يَجُزْ وَإِلَّا جَازَ. That you look, this narration, is it circulating in the full way? Has this person himself or someone else transmitted this narration in full before? If someone before has transmitted it already in full, then it's fine for you to summarize it, because people have at their disposal the full narration. But if no one has ever transmitted this in full, then as the first time you will have to transmit it in full. So that's the third view, and then the fourth view is the same view which Ibn Hajar rahmallah mentioned here. But look at how Mullah al-Qari rahmallah says. He says, وَرَابِعُهَا وَهُوَ الصَّحِيحُ الَّذِي ذَهَبَ إِلَيْهِ الْأَكْثَرُ. That this here is the view which the vast majority, or إِلَيْهِ الْأَكْثَرُونَ, the vast majority have taken this view. وَاخْتَارَ ibn Salah. And likewise Ibn Salah rahimahullah, he also has chosen this view. And then from Ibn Salah rahmallah, the commentators and those who worked on the book of Ibn Salah rahmallah, they also then adopted, most of them adopted this view. Obviously there's some discussion there which we will discuss when we come to the relevant chapter. It's in Muqaddamah Ibn Salah. But Imam Nawawi rahmallah, he mentioned in his commentary of Sahih Muslim, وَالصَّحِيحُ الَّذِي ذَهَبَ إِلَيْهِ الْجَمَاهِيرُ وَالْمُحَقِّقُونَ مِنْ أَصْحَابِ الْحَدِيثِ وَالْفِقْهِ وَالْأُصُولِ التَّفْصِيلِ. So he's saying that this here is the view of Jumhur, the vast majority of scholars, not only the vast majority of scholars of Hadith, but rather the vast majority of scholars of fiqh and the vast majority of scholars of usul. That وَجَوَازُ ذَلِكَ مِنَ الْعَارِفِ, that the person has to know what he is transmitting, then it will be permissible. So from here you can gauge that this here is a masla where Ibn Hajar rahmallah is preferring the view of scholars before him. You know, sometimes Ibn Hajar rahmallah made up his own stuffs here, chose his own views here, created his own divisions, etc. But this is one view where he is choosing what the scholars. Very recently, in Maqlub and Mustarib, we explained how Ibn Hajar rahmallah mentioned it in a different way and presented it in a different way compared to what his predecessors and earlier scholars mentioned. But remember, one is permissibility and the other is what is more meritorious. So we find that Ibn Umayr rahmallah, he said that the person asked Imam Malik rahmallah, Ya Aba Abdullah, al-Rajul yakhtasir al-Hadith? Asked Imam Malik, that can a person? So look, Imam Malik rahmallah, he said, Ma kana min hadith Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, fa inni uhibbu an yu'ta bihi ala jihatihi. That if the words are from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then he's using the words fa inni uhibbu, and that is why we didn't add Imam Malik's name in the list of those who forbade this, because you can see he's saying fa inni uhibbu. I would love that such a person mentions the hadith in a precise wording. Wa amma ma kana min kalamin nas, but yes, if you are transmitting a word of a sahabi or a tabi'i, then if you have to condense it, if you change the wording, then that is fine. فَلَا بَأْسَ بِهِ. Likewise, with another sanad it's mentioned from Imam Malik rahmallah, he clearly said that لَا بَأْسَ بِهِ إِلَّا حَدِيث رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم فَإِنِّي أَسْتَحِبُّ أَن يُؤْتَى بِهِ عَلَى أَلْفَاظِهِ. And therefore, Imam Malik rahmallah, he was actually very, very strict. Another student of his, Ma'an ibn Isa, he says that كان مالك بن أنس يتحفظ من الياء والباء والتاء في حديث رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. He wouldn't allow you to alter even one letter, leave alone a word. He wouldn't even allow you to alter one letter when quoting the words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he mentions that when they would read a hadith to him, they would memorize the hadith, when they would say it back to him, أنه كان يأخذ عليهم الألف والواو. If they had to make a small mistake of an alif or a waw, Imam Malik rahmallah would pull out that mistake. He would not allow them. Like Abdurrahman ibn Yazid, he said that كان عبد الله يأخذ علينا فيها الواو. That Imam Malik rahmallah is actually inheriting this practice. It's not Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu would also in the tashahhud, if they would make a mistake, he would correct that mistake, even if it was a wow, even if it was one letter. So for us, in our cases, how we benefit from this chapter, when we need to transmit a hadith. So, you know that I must have told you before that what's the best to do. You see, when you're giving a speech, you're giving a lecture, and this year, my father actually told it to me. He's saying that whenever you have to quote a Quranic verse or quote a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, then it's best to always quote the original Arabic. And the reason what he told me is saying because our words, we know that we speak so much incorrect things with our tongues, and now we come and try to give da'wah with our tongues. It doesn't have any impact. But the words of the Prophet ﷺ is nur. So therefore, as much as possible, we try to convey the exact words of the Prophet ﷺ. So even though you just have, like for the example, the Jummah Bayan, only have 20 minutes to speak before the khutbah, in those 20 minutes, if you have to quote anything from the Prophet ﷺ, you quote the words. So in our case, we try to memorize the words exactly as it is without even altering a ya or a ta or even altering any letter. Now Ibn Hajar explains why he said that the person has to be knowledgeable. So he's explaining that a person, when he's knowledgeable, then he'll know what he can drop off and what he must keep. لأن العالم لا ينقص من الحديث إلا ما لا تعلق له بما يبقيه منه. That the import of the narration should not differ بحيث لا تختلف الدلالة. What that narration is denoting upon, you shouldn't lose the whole meaning when trying to condense it. So a scholar would know that I can condense it in this way and it will convey the exact intent of the Prophet ﷺ. What I am presenting in a shorter, with less words, it conveys the full meaning what the Prophet ﷺ said or what words have been conveyed to me. وَلَا يَخْتَلُّ الْبَيَانِ, the explanation will not suffer from any shortcomings, the explanation and the import of that narration. فَإِنَّ حَذْفَهُ غَيْرُ جَائِزٍ اتِّفَاقًا. Because if you are going to be changing the meaning, then ittifaqan, Allama Munawi rahmallah mentions, in all circumstances, it's not going to be permissible because now you are altering the meaning. So there is a big difference between summary and between distorting. And like we have just quoted earlier, that many, when they attempted to summarize, they ended up distorting. So in short, it is permissible as long as the meaning is not impacted. In fact, Sheikh Khudair, he mentions that the same is about the Quran. وإذا جاز الاقتصار على بعض الآية دون بعض فالحديث في الشرط المتقدم من باب الأولى. That everyone agrees that it's permissible a verse of the Quran that you can mention just a portion of the verse. But again, it has to be such that it's not going to alter the meaning. So he gives the example. He says, you can't go and tell people that look, in the Quran it comes وَيْلٌ لِلْمُصَلِّينَ and لَا تَقْرَبُوا الصَّلَاةِ. So from now, no more you should pray. Because now you are altering the meaning. So although it does come in the Quran, but you cannot mention it because it's going to change the meaning of the entire verse. So in the same way, but there are other verses. وَإِذَا جَازَ الْإِقْتِصَارُ عَلَى بَعْضِ الْآيَةِ فِي مِثْلِ قَوْلِهِ تَعَالَى إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُكُمْ أَن تُؤَدُّوا الْأَمَانَاتِ إِلَى أَهْلِهَا. So then you don't have to complete the entire verse. So in the same way, here you can mention portion of the narration. So he says, حَتَّى يَكُونَ الْمَذْكُورُ وَالْمَحْذُوفُ بِمَنْزِلَةِ خَبْرَيْنِ. That the person who knows about it, he knows that what I am not mentioning is because it has a total different meaning. And therefore, it's like a completely different narration. So he will know what to delete from the narration. That it will be such words that if it is mentioned separately, it has an absolutely independent meaning. And it can stand as a totally different narration. أما ما لا يتعلق به فيجوز حذفه لأنه كخبر مستقل. That if words in that one narration does not have anything to do with the main meaning or the, of that narration, then it's permissible to drop off those words because it is like a totally separate narration. أو يدل ما ذكره على ما حذفه. So he's saying that, or maybe the scholar, he will know that when I'm mentioning this here, I'm keeping these words and mentioning these words. These words which I am mentioning, they clearly denote upon those words which I have deleted. So the full meaning is still conveyed. So basically, a scholar will know exactly how to summarize a narration. And therefore, those who had the expertise, they did summarize. Because obviously, mentioning the ruling, we also have to look at the practice of the scholars of the past. So, وَصَنِيعُ الْأَئِمَّةِ جَارٍ عَلَى جَوَازِ الْإِخْتِصَارِ. That we find all the scholars of the past, many scholars, they would condense narrations. And if you read Sahih al-Bukhari, وصحيح البخاري مملوء من أجزاء الحديث التي يقتصر فيها الإمام البخاري على موضع الحاجة من الحديث. So Sheikh Nuruddin in Manhaj al-Naqdi mentions the practice of Imam Bukhari in Sahih al-Bukhari فإنه يروي الحديث الواحد في مواضع كثيرة بحسب ما يستنبط من الحديث من القواعد والأحكام. So if a narration, for example, speaks about Salah, in Zakah, in Siyam, in Hajj, but if Imam Bukhari rahmallah only wanted to make istidlal on one, then he would only mention that one portion which deals with the subject and the chapter. ويروي في كل مناسبة الجملة التي تلائمها من متن الحديث ويذكره بتمامه في بعض المواضع ليعلمه القارئ كله. So you can see Imam Bukhari rahmallah, he frequently does this here. Likewise, Imam Abu Dawud rahmallah in his Risala ila Ahli Makkah, he mentioned that وَرُبَّمَا اخْتَصَرْتُ الْحَدِيثَ الطَّوِيلِ لأني لو كتبته بطوله لم يعلم بعض من سمعه. Some of those who are listening to the entire lengthy hadith, they won't be able to catch up which exact portion I am making istidlal from. ولا يفهم موضع الفقه منه فاختصرت لذلك. So therefore, I have summarized the narration so that it's easy to understand how I am making istidlal from that particular narration. So all this here, only that person can do who is an alim. بخلاف الجاهل فإنه قد ينقص ما له تعلق. Because he would delete very integral words which hold significance, which impact the meaning. For example, katarkil istithna. He will leave out an istithna. So if you leave out the istithna, it changes the whole meaning. 100% it changes it. So Mullah al-Qari gives the example, لا يباع الذهب بالذهب إلا سواء بسواء. That you should not sell gold in exchange of gold. Now if you stop there, it means that you cannot ever change gold in exchange of gold. So if you have a Krugerrand and another person has a gold jewelry, different forms, you want to swap, you can't swap it. Why? Because it's gold in exchange of gold. There's no way you got a gold a nugget and you got gold jewelry and you want to swap it, it's not permissible. But that's it. If you're dropping off this istithna, illa sawa'an bisawa', if you're just saying la yuba'u dhahab bidhahab sawa'an bisawa', then the whole meaning is changing, that it should not be in equal amounts. But the meaning of the hadith, by putting that istithna, it means that it should be in equal amounts. That so many grams of gold in exchange of so many grams of gold. You cannot alter the amount. So you can see how just dropping off that one letter alters the whole meaning. فَإِنَّهُ لَا يَجُوزُ حَذْفُهُ بِلَا خِلَافٍ. Everyone will agree that in this case here, you cannot drop off such a letter. So on the one hand, it was really difficult to always quote the narration in full. But then on the other hand, if a person doesn't know how to condense the narration, it could lead to changing the meaning like this here. It could lead to actually mass distortion. So an incompetent person, he can end up omitting very essential portions of the narration. And therefore, Ibn Hajar rahmallah put this clause. So in short, the person has to know how to condense the narration. And then besides being impermissible for an ignorant person to condense and to summarize the narration, if he has to actually leave out essential points. Now when scholars are going to look at his narration, what they are going to see? They're going to see that he made a mistake here. Or they're going to accuse him of being negligent. Or they're going to say he's forgetting. So now they will assume that this is how he remembers the narration. They won't understand that he was attempting to make ikhtisar, and that is how he created this huge distortion. Rather, what he will do, they will assume that he is making a mistake here, or he's being negligent here, or he's forgetting, and therefore now they will start to call him a muttaham, or they will call him ghafil, or they will call him sayyi'ul hifz. So now this is going to have a direct impact on his memory or on his integrity. And that ultimately is going to affect the authenticity of all of his other narrations which he transmitted. So therefore the same ruling applies whether a person is muttaham, he's not fully trusted, and whether he does it one time. So yeah, Imam Nawawi rahmallah in his commentary of Sahih Muslim, and from there all the commentators mention it, that هذا إن ارتفعت منزلته عن التهمة, that the person shouldn't be such that people still accuse him, they still have reservations against him. Basically, he's not fully trusted. Why? Because he himself could end up sometimes narrating it in full, and then at other times he's transmitting it in a condensed or a summary of it. People could assume that maybe he forgot. So فَأَمَّا مَنْ رَوَاهُ تَامًا ثُمَّ خَافَ إِنْ رَوَاهُ ثَانِيًا نَاقِصًا أَن يُتَّهَمْ بِزِيَادَةٍ أَوَّلًا. Maybe they can accuse him and said the first time he added his own words, and now the second time when he's mentioning it in a shorter way, then it is correct. Or maybe they could say that he forgot لِغَفْلَةٍ وَقِلَّةِ ضَبْطٍ فَلَا يَجُوزُ لَهُ النُّقْصَانُ ثَانِيًا. So Imam Munawi rahmallah, I told you all the commentators took it. Mullah al-Qari mentions it, all of them, Sheikh Wajih al-Gujarati, Laqani, Imam Munawi rahmallah mentions it. وَكَلَامُ شَامِلٌ لِمَا إِذَا كَانَ الرَّاوِي الْمُخْتَصِرُ رَوَى الْحَدِيث أولا تاما وقد صرح بعضهم بخلافه فقال إذا رواه تاما ثم خاف من روايته مختصرا أن يتهم بالزيادة أو النقص أو بالغفلة وقلة الضبط فإنه لا يمتنع عليه. So other scholars mention a contradictory view, that he mustn't worry about what people are going to think about him. Nevertheless, you have these views which are mentioned. In short, that if a person knows how to summarize a narration, then it is fine. And therefore we find that the great scholars and stalwarts like Ibn al-Mubarak rahimahullah, they actually learned how to condense a narration, how to do a summary of a narration. So Abdullah ibn Mubarak rahimahullah, he says, "Allamana Sufyan ikhtisar al-Ḥadīth." It's Sufyan taught us how to condense a narration. This comes in Al-Muhaddith al-Fasil, also comes in Al-Kifaya and Al-Madkhal of Imam Bayhaqi. So if a person is to drop off a portion of the narration because he doubts whether now this here is portion of the narration or not, then this here is now a separate issue. In اختصار علوم الحديث ابن كثير رحمه الله said, أما إذا حذف الزيادة لكونه شك فيها فهذا سائغ كان مالك يفعل ذلك كثيرا. Imam Malik rahimahullah would do this a lot. So you can see now, obviously I don't have to tell you about the memory of Imam Malik rahimahullah, but yet when he doubted, then he would not narrate. So you can see that also someone, even the alim, at times will drop off something which could maybe have an impact on the meaning, but solely because he doubts about it, he will not do it. So this, for us now, the benefit of this entire thing is that we know that scholars in the past, if they had to summarize narrations, then since they were scholars, it was permissible for them. For us, if we need to summarize a narration and we can do it in a very professional way, knowing that we are not distorting the meaning, then it is fine. But the best for us also is to always try to mention the narration in full. Inshallah, we will continue on Thursday. Until then, Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.